Hello, my friend. It is day 9 of the Painting the Wilderness Seascapes Challenge. We're almost done, second to last day, and today is probably our most ambitious painting yet. We're painting a shimmery reflection of a palm tree dancing on top of waves that already are reflecting light and other shadows. And if you take one look at this painting and think there is no way that I could possibly paint that, I thought the exact same thing. And I'm gonna show you how I proved myself wrong and how, at the very least, you can learn a lot along the way. So remember, as we're painting this painting, creativity is about the process, right? Creativity is about finding tiny moments of wonder, tiny fragments of joy that you can bring with you, you can hold every single day. And this painting is full of those. We have so many fun blends, we have some fun contrast to explore, and even if it turns out a little messy, even if it turns out a little wonky, I know that today can bring you a whole lot of joy. So let's get started. Are you ready? It's day 9, and this project will probably be one of the messiest yet. That's because it's going to use a lot of water control, a lot of blending with colors, but that's why I chose a pretty simple composition for this, because really all we're painting is one single palm tree reflected in the water. But there's obviously a lot more complexity and depth going on with the reflection and with the water play, and so that's what we're going to have a lot of fun exploring today. And remember that even if your end result doesn't turn out the way that you want, even if the middle is a giant mess, you can still find moments of joy and tiny little sparks of, wonder that will help you make this project really worth your while. Okay, so first things first, we're going to begin with the sky. The sky is only going to take up a very small portion of the piece, and I'm using a bright blue, so it's Winsor blue green shade or phthalo blue green shade, depending on what one you have. There is going to be a cloud along like the bottom left-hand corner of that sky. So I'm keeping that in mind, not putting tons of paint in that corner, even though I'm going to use a towel to lift the cloud, lift the paint from the paper in the shape of the cloud. So similar to past projects we've done, I'm taking an artist towel. You can use a paper towel too, that would work. And I'm just pressing down pretty hard on the paper in order to lift kind of like that, billowy cloud-like texture where the cloud is higher along the edge and a little bit kind of jutting into the sky and then tapers off as we go to that right-hand side. So I have my cloud. I'm not really doing any shadows to it because I do just kind of want it to be a light and fluffy white cloud. So that's going to work. While the paper is still wet, you might have to re-wet it at this point if it has kind of dried. I'm going to put down kind of a pale orange color, which I've mixed with Opera Rose and Lemon Yellow Deep. And it's very light, it's very watery, very light. And I'm just gonna do a little bit of it just beneath the cloud, kind of going up into the sky, but I'm not really worrying too much about it. And then this part's optional. You don't have to do what I'm painting right now, but while my paper was still wet, I just decided to make my sky slightly more vibrant by adding a little bit more of that phthalo blue, of that Winsor blue. But then it started encroaching in my cloud, and so I used my towel again to kind of just, lift the pigment, lift the paint so that my cloud stayed that kind of light and fluffy texture. So I have that tiny little wisp of orange, and then I have my sky and my clouds. And once again, this part is optional. You don't have to repaint it because it is a little bit trickier, but I wanted my sky to be very vibrant. And so I basically just repeated that step, except I only kept the blue paint in that corner, and then I just used, I re-wet it, put the blue paint in that corner, and then used a towel to clean up the edges of the cloud. And I think it worked out okay. Then I let that dry all the way. This painting requires lots of layers, lots of painting with drying all the way in between before painting again. And then I re-wet with clean water, and now I'm going to focus on laying down the first layers of the ocean. The ocean is going to be reflecting lots of different colors. It's going to have the blues and greens of typical water, but it's also reflecting yellow and orange and the colors of the sunset of the sun generally just kind of reflecting in the ocean. So I'm laying down that kind of orange color first, and then I'm also laying down some just kind of plain lemon yellow deep. I'm generally, when I'm painting, using this kind of zigzag motion, although we are going to place phthalo turquoise on top of this in the next layer. So the turquoise is where it's going to be most important to use that zigzag shape, but it is useful to practice it now. And the one thing to keep in mind as we're painting all of these layers on top of each other, I added another kind of coral mix, but this time pink is a little bit more prevalent. We do want all of the colors to show. So while I am painting all of this in one layer, you could, if you were patient enough, you could paint these one layer at a time. So like one layer of yellow, let dry, one layer of orange, let dry, one layer of pink, let dry. And that would probably help to keep your layers a little bit more intact. So we have that first layer of the bright colors, and then I let dry all the way, and then I re-wet with clean water. And now I'm laying down some phthalo turquoise, and this is where I'm kind of giving the waves a gentle shape. So I know that at the bottom right-hand corner and along the bottom is where the water is going to be the most blue-ish green, right? And then it's kind of gently going to jut into the colorful parts. And so because I'm using the wet on wet technique, right? I don't want the watercolor to completely overtake the colorful bits. So I am placing down the phthalo turquoise in kind of gentle wave-like strokes, and then I'm going back with a clean brush to kind of clean up the edges, right? So, and it's with a thirsty brush too, which is important to note. A thirsty brush is specifically when the paintbrush is damp, right? As opposed to just like dripping wet, because when it's damp, then you can kind of lift the paint and shape it so that it stays put relatively. So while this layer is also still wet, this layer of green, I am just kind of gently using a small brush, placing a little bit more colorful parts, just kind of in the midst of the green, especially toward the top. And this kind of dance is going to be like, I'm starting from the sides, I'm using this kind of gentle zigzag motion, and I'm going to use that same motion to alternate between adding pink and oranges and yellows, and then also adding turquoise back in the next layers. One last thing I'm going to do in this layer is I am using lemon yellow deep with a very small size 2 brush to just kind of, it's like creating a gentle little shimmery reflection right at the bottom. And while it's still wet, I'm just kind of, it's very loose squiggles almost. This is optional, by the way. I'm painting very loose squiggles along the bottom because, sometimes when light reflects on water, you get kind of like weirdly shaped reflections dancing on top of the waves. This is what I'm doing. And so I'm alternating between adding lemon yellow deep, and then I also went in with just plain water. That part, that little squiggle reflection light thing that's dancing at the bottom, totally optional. You don't have to do that. I mean, you don't have to do any of this really, but that was just something I was experimenting with, and it seemed kind of fun. So I let that dry. That was just the first layer. Notice how after it's dry, the colors have become really muted, right? They're pretty muted. And so that's why we're going to keep doing pretty much the same thing that we have been doing, only we are going to, we're just going to keep doing it, but with slightly more vibrant, slightly darker value colors. So I let it dry, and then I re-wet with clean water. And now, because I want the colors to be more vibrant, I'm using a smaller brush sometimes. I'm not always going to use that smaller brush, but I'm mostly sticking to a size 6 or a size 2 at this point. And I did let my paper dry slightly so that my color is not so wild and unruly. Because now, instead of just like laying down color, I'm trying to kind of shape it, right? Where maybe the left-hand side is more where the yellow, orange, pink color lives, right? That's where it's kind of jutting out from the left-hand side into the middle, and the right-hand side is more where the turquoise lives, and so it's kind of jutting out and meeting so that we create this kind of zigzag back and forth motion where sometimes it's that yellow pink, sometimes it's that green turquoise, and then there's also lots of white space, light space in between. And we get that luminous texture where like the white of the paper kind of shines through the transparency of the watercolor by using lots of water. But then we maintain the vibrance by using lots of layers. See, so this is like a very careful dance between adding water and using a thirsty brush to kind of shape the waves and also, keep the pigment in place. And we're also using a thirsty brush to kind of act as a buffer between the yellow waves and the green waves. But then we're also using pigment and layers to make sure that we don't lose the color. Because if you use too much water, sometimes you can lose the vibrance of the color. And so this is the kind of dance that we're playing, where as we get down to the bottom, it's a lot more green, it's a lot more blue. I also added some more phthalo blue and even a little bit of Prussian blue down at the bottom right now. But even as I add waves, I make sure to go back in with a thirsty brush to kind of shape them and to make sure that they blend in a little bit more smoothly with the piece as a whole. Then I'm going back in with very pigmented lemon yellow deep and doing that same kind of squiggle dance down there. And so that whole thing, now my wet on wet layer is done, and that whole wet on wet process took me quite a while. It probably took me at least half an hour to do. And it was just a lot of dancing back and forth, being wildly uncomfortable while doing it, and making sure that while the yellow was kind of veering into the green, I could still see at least some parts of the yellow. Like that was my main goal, is to make sure the top was relatively still yellow and I could still see some of the yellow waves as I ventured down into the green and blue areas. So now I'm painting the palm tree, right? Where I started with the trunk, and I want the trunk to be at that area, like just below the orange space and just above where the water is. And then while that trunk was kind of wet, this is wet on dry, while that trunk was still kind of wet at the bottom, I just took a small brush with some clean water and I gently blended the bottom of the trunk into the ocean, kind of feathered it down into the dry area of the paper. Then I'm starting to paint the palm fronds, and I'm sorry, I know you can't see them very well, just because the angle of the camera, but I'm using my size 6 brush. You can use a smaller brush if that's more helpful for you. But because this palm is, basically the only subject that's contrasting against the water, I'm taking a little bit more care to paint the fronds. And the way that I do that is I'm painting like one arch, basically, one kind of swooping place as a center for where the leaves are going to fall. And then I kind of paint just a few loose leaf strokes, kind of like raining down in a slightly curved motion coming down from that frond. And so I'm just doing that over and over again with different leaves, different sections of leaves. And I'm telling myself I don't have to get this exactly right. I'm not trying to make this look exactly like a palm tree. I'm just trying to make this look like a palm tree, even if it's an imperfect one. I also added some brown coconuts in there, like 3 coconuts while the palms were still wet, so you can't see them very well, but that was kind of fun. And then I went back in with a darker green and added a little bit of contrast on top of the leaves. Now, the reflection. This is real time. I'm painting this squiggle in real time. So as you can see, a big part of the reflection is just like I am taking kind of like a greenish brown color where I mixed burnt umber with that kind of blue turquoise mix that I had, and I added lots of water, so it's very diluted, lots of water, And I'm just loosely painting a squiggle, wet on dry, right on top of the ocean. And the squiggle part is because it's on waves, right? So that's why it's kind of that loose zigzag squiggle. Then, in order to paint the part where, the big fronds, the big palm tree is actually showing, I'm basically using that same, my son's hand is in there a little bit because he came to join me. Using that same paint color, I just painted kind of like a very squiggly square. And I don't know how else to describe it, except that's what I did. It's very wonky. It's very, like the melted clocks thing. It's very much like I want it to look like a reflection that's elongated and where the form is kind of distressed. And in order to do that, I just painted random strokes in kind of a loose square and with like some texture, and the edges are really squiggly, and I let that be exactly what it is. So that's what I painted. And then after I finished that, I went back in with with a small brush, as you can see, and I'm painting some more wet on dry layers, kind of with that dark green, not dark green, but like that same kind of reflection green that is fairly light value. So we're kind of just glazing on top of it. But especially on the right-hand side, painting some of those darker reflections in very loose, horizontal kind of zigzag shapes, coming out from the left side, a little bit on the right side. Oh, not left side, sorry, right side. It's mostly coming out from the right side, going left. And, darker toward the bottom, a little bit toward the top. That's just to kind of snap this into place and also to provide some contrast between that very light source, that very light area on the left-hand side of the sky where the sun presumably is, and those wet on dry layers. There are very few of them, right? I had maybe one kind of big one toward the bottom, but these just kind of very loose zigzags, broken lines. For me, those wet on dry layers are what kind of snapped this into place to say like, oh yeah, this is a reflection on top of water. It's also important for you to know that when you get up close to this painting, it does not look like a realistic reflection. It just looks like a bunch of lines and a bunch of random colors, and it looks odd. But then when you zoom out, right, when you're looking at it from this angle, and especially for me, I had to take some time before I did this. I didn't actually untape it and do the loved learned thing. It took me about a day to get back to it and finish this. And I'm so glad, because the space in between, I came back to it and said to myself, oh, actually, this looks pretty good. So, I'm going to talk about that. So now we're going to this painting is finished. We're going to talk about what I loved and what I learned. I really love using a towel to lift soft clouds, especially if they're those white clouds. And because they're more subtle in the background, I didn't need them to be super detailed, and they just I loved that effect. I also really loved how I was able to create kind of a luminous effect between the yellow and the green, so that a lot of the white paper was shining through in the ocean. And I really loved painting the shadow, even though it looked wonky and I felt really uncomfortable. What I learned is that contrast helps, right? The wet on dry, very briefly, contrasted with the wet on wet, really helped. Space helps. Having space in between when I finished and when I looked at it again really helped me to see it for what it was. And I learned a lot about water control here, in that it's so wild and unruly, but also a lot of fun. I hope you had fun with this one.